Professor Stroebe, I'm really delighted to have you with us today and really looking forward to your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lucy, very much. I'm also delighted to be here. I would have been even more delighted if we could have met personally and had this conference in Bristol, as I'm sure all your participants would have liked, but this is just lovely to be able to do it this way as well. Bristol has a very warm place in my heart because I was actually a graduate student there, and it was many, many years ago now, but my passion for cross-cultural psychology was born there. Basically, I was in a program for cross-cultural psychology, and it was also at that time that I developed an interest in research on grief. And that was partly because I had to teach workshops with medical students at the Department of Mental Health in Bristol. And at that time, grief came up as a topic for the medical students. So yeah, I had hoped to come back and almost bring it full circle. All my interests coming together, but anyway, we're doing it from afar, and this is almost a new beginning, one can say, going online for the first time.
That's right. We're delighted to have you. Thank you.
So, to get into the topic itself, we're going to focus, as Lucy has already said, on the dual process model of coping with bereavement, and I'm going to cover 3 parts in my talk. I'll give you some background as to why we felt we needed to develop the model. I will describe it and give some applications. So first of all, back to Bristol. If you can see this rather old-looking article, in 1967, it's got there, Mortality of Bereavement. This actually was an article that I had to discuss with the medical students in Bristol at the Mental Health Institute. And this was actually the basis probably for my fascination. The idea that you could actually die if you became bereaved, that it could be so impactful on you that you would die yourself. And if you can see it, just under the title of the article, there is a little epitaph. And it says, "He first deceased, she for a little tried to live without him, liked it not, and died." And that is a remarkable phenomenon. Can you really die of a broken heart? And that was the fascinating question, I think, that started me off on reviewing the literature and seeing if this actually was the case. In the meantime, a lot of studies have been done to investigate the mortality of bereavement. That study was a very small one. It was surprising they found results, but in the meantime, a lot of studies have confirmed these early results. A lot of large longitudinal controlled general and cause-specific studies have been done across different countries. And they have, in fact, confirmed what was found in that early study. And the explanations, they've looked into why the rates were higher for bereaved people than for non-bereaved people. And indeed, it does seem that the broken heart is a phenomenon, partly. Other things change when you become bereaved, social ties change, and they've looked into other causes as well, living, eating, people don't eat properly, they lose social support, or they change their patterns generally, and those could also contribute to this increased mortality. But it's important to know that not many people actually die of a broken heart. The rates are not really very high at all. So given this, you need thousands of people actually in a study to indicate that there is this effect. On the other hand, a lot of people suffer from bereavement, as we know, and as I'm sure I don't need to emphasize here. Let me just show you the patterns. Prevalences of complicated grief and other problems This is a slide of bereaved partners, and it covers a lot of different studies, actually. It is compiled from various sources, just to give a rough indication. There are lots of numbers here, but what I do want to show you is that health problems do follow from bereavement. Complicated grief is a well-known phenomenon now. Physical health difficulties occur, self-reported, sometimes severe. Psychiatric disorders, both post-traumatic stress disorder and clinical depression. But if you look at the prevalence, what you see is that these are minorities. They're quite substantial minorities, but they are troubles that do not occur for the majority of bereaved people. Most people manage to cope with their loss in their own way over time, suffering for many, acutely for many, but complications in terms of disorders occur in a minority of people. This is confirmed as well in the next slide, where George Bonanno investigated trajectories of grieving, his famous work some years ago now, but also confirming what I said shown in the last slide, that some people suffer from chronic grieving patterns, but the range of numbers is from about 10 to 30%. Most people you see at the bottom line are resilient. Some have delayed and some recover over time, but most people do get through their grief in time on their own. Nevertheless, there is suffering. And we compiled, looking at all the scientific articles we could find some time ago when we were actually trying to develop a scale of grieving, ones that have been done much better by other people in the meantime and much more famous ones. But this is just to give you an idea of the range of reactions that we found in connection with grief and grieving. And we've divided them here into affective, behavioral, cognitive, and physiological. They overlap a little. The categories are simply to try to get some regularity to this complexity of reactions. And I think what becomes evident here is that grief is a complex emotional syndrome. Not all of these reactions will be seen in any particular person or at any particular time, but it gives you an impression of the range of reactions that you're likely to find when somebody is bereaved. Looking at one of the affective reactions, loneliness, you could imagine in times of corona that this might be a particularly impactful and hard reaction to deal with when one is away from one's loved ones, when one can't travel, and so on and so forth. This might be a complication, particularly under certain types of bereavement. So this gives the background, really. What I'm trying to get across until now is really the idea that we study bereavement because it has negative consequences, because people suffer, because some people need help, some people need professional help. And we need to understand the phenomena of grief and grieving in order to help people effectively. So going on to coping, let's consider these two statements by famous poets, writers. Shakespeare said, "Give sorrow words. The grief that does not speak whispers the overfraught heart and bids it break." Or Daniel, "Grief keep within, and scorn to show but tears, disdain to sigh, for so can slender cares grow." Now, in scientific terms, these are incredibly important hypotheses, one could say. The first one is telling us, to share our grief, to disclose it, to talk about it, to feel it. And the other, stiff upper lip, keep it to yourself, otherwise it'll get worse. These are potentially ways of coping, and coping can be influenced. And this is why I think Henk and I considered it most important to focus on coping with grief and grieving in our work. It's something that can be changed. You can't change the dreadful fact that you've lost a loved person. You can potentially change the way you go about dealing with it. You can change your thoughts about it. You can work on your own feelings. And these here are two different ways that one could imagine one could go about coping. Here we see perhaps a pictorial representation of the two statements that I just showed you. On the one hand, we see a rather stiff gentleman and his wife bent over. These are the portraits, the sculptures of Katie Kollwitz. Some of you will know her work, the German sculptress whose son died at the end of the First World War. When he was 19, he was killed. And this sculpture of herself and her husband took her actually 19 years to produce. It's one of the most impactful sculptures. I will come back to her work later. All right, so going from the poetic to the pictorial to the scientific, how do we go about studying it? Back in the 80s, Wortman and Silver produced some very important articles where they looked at basic assumptions of Western societies about grief and grieving. And from this, they managed to give you time to edit that. Yeah. So what they found from the literature was that scientists claimed that people have to confront their personal feelings and reactions to the death. Failure to confront these intense emotions is maladaptive. Thus, the assumption was that to adjust, we need to do grief work. That was a basic assumption at that time in Western societies, at least. And all that I'm saying so far, many of you will be thinking of other cultures, perhaps. Does it apply? Are those bereavement reactions really universal? Those are empirical questions. They're ones that really can be examined. So in any case, in the West, the idea is that you have to do grief work. And I reviewed the literature, as I love to do, and found that indeed it was claimed by many people, both in the grief theories and therapies. I found that this was confirmed. It's the process of emotionally confronting the reality of loss, of going over events that occurred before and at the time of the death, and of focusing on memories and working toward detachment from the deceased. I think these days we wouldn't work towards detachment. I would change that statement now, where we know much more about continuing, keeping relationships with deceased people going. So I think that word I wouldn't use anymore, but it certainly was around that. And that was the basic notion as to how people could get over their grief without getting into the difficulties that you saw the minority of people go through. Next slide, please. Here we see two models of grief work, famous models, impactful models, important models. The first by John Bowlby, the father of attachment theory, whose trilogy on attachment is classic and supportive evidence, a body of research these days supporting his important theory. So he developed a phase model based on his notions of attachment and security of attachment. Bill Warden, some of you will also be familiar with his task model, his handbook for mental health care practitioners on grief counseling and grief therapy. And his model is also very important. So basically, the 4 phases that Bowlby proposed were first shock, yearning and protest, despair, and restitution. And these are the reactions that occur when separation takes place, separation from a loved person. The notion being you want desperately to get back to that person. You want to be reunited with the person. The task model, very simply again, too, was that you have to accept the reality of loss, experience the pain of grief, adjust to life without the deceased, and then relocate the deceased emotionally and move on. So going through those tasks was considered to be therapeutic, to be helpful in adjusting to the loss of a loved one. And what Henk and I appreciated about both of these models was really the way that they structured how coping can take place. The one based on an attachment theory and the other on an effortful task model, one where we felt that the difficulties that bereaved people experience and the effort that is needed to deal with it are well portrayed. Next slide, please. Nevertheless, we felt these models said part of what was going on, but we felt that more needed to be said. We felt that there were alternative ways of effective coping that are not captured in these models. Those are really confrontive models. You have to confront, but there are different ways. And if we look at different cultures, next slide, please. Next slide, please. We find different, almost recipes, different ways of coping in different cultures. Take this shrine in Japan with the photo of the deceased person, and an early statement by Yamamoto, I think, brings it home to us, the difference with our own ways of thinking. The ancestor remains accessible. The mourner can talk to the ancestor. He can offer goodies such as food or even cigarettes. Although the ancestor is revered, fed, watered, and altogether the ancestor is revered, fed, watered, and remains with the bereaved. And I actually did my cross-cultural research in Southeast Asia and stayed for a year with a Chinese widowed lady. And we did actually revere her husband. We put glasses of wine out for him. We put beer out for him. We lit a cigarette for him, and we folded paper money to keep the connection and to make him comfortable in the next world. Next slide, please. A very different way of going about grief is among the traditional Navajo Indians of North America in the olden days, where mourning is limited to 4 days, and after that, the deceased person is not spoken of, mentioned, thought about, in order that his passage becomes easier. It's just forbidden in the traditional culture there to speak of the deceased person. The anthropologists who investigated this culture at that time, Miller and Schoenfeld, thought that it might have consequences, but they couldn't see really any clear examples of that. Next slide, please. So to go beyond the alternative ways, there is also, we felt, at least in the phasal model, a neglect of the effortful struggle. I think that Warden captured that, as I've already said. There's also a need for dosage of grief. As so many of you will know, grief is exhausting. You cannot do it all the time. It's just too difficult to face up to loss all the time of the day. You need to recuperate, you need time off. There are also benefits of denial. In one very interesting early study of Holocaust survivors, it was found that those who actually did not dream at all about their dreadful, didn't have nightmares, actually were better off than people who did not deny it. There are also other sources of stress. Yes, we need to think no further than the corona situation to realize, how many additional stresses occur when one loses a loved person. So it isn't just the loss of the person, him or herself, but it's dealing with isolation, dealing with getting food, dealing with taking over the tasks that the deceased person had managed, dealing with the finances, dealing with dreadful legal matters. There's also lack of empirical evidence. And when Henk and I first met, this was something that came actually, from both our studies, we met and we found that each other had found the same results, that grief work, the people who were doing grief work, actually didn't seem to be getting over their grief over the long term better than those who were more suppressing of their grief. So Henk's findings showed that in one study, our findings showed that in another study. And this was very puzzling. We should be able to show that grief work is doing its work and helping us to get over the loss of a loved one. Lack of conceptual clarity. Next slide, please. Grief work is something that's supposed to be positive. Rumination is known to have negative effects. This, by the way, is also one of Katie Kolwitz's works. So what is the difference between grief work and rumination? And when it was in the 80s, and I was fortunate enough to be at a conference with John Bowlby, and there was a Meet the Authors session, and I literally was sitting at his feet because the room was so crowded. But I plucked up the courage to ask him, what's the difference between grief work and rumination? And he thought very hard, and then he said, I don't know. And I thought, if Bowlby doesn't know, how on earth? But I think we now know the difference. And I think that this is a very important difference. We've done studies on this, which I don't have time to share with you, unfortunately. But modern technical advances have enabled us to show when people are actually confronting or avoiding by looking away from a figure that is perhaps traumatic on screen, things like that. And what we find is that grief work is confrontive. Rumination looks like confrontation, but it is actually an avoidant process in the sense that what you are avoiding is the terrible reality that the person has gone and will never return. It's an if only, it's a counterfactual way of thinking, as we call it. It's avoiding the stark reality. If only I'd got him to keep his medical advice and keep his diet, then he would be still alive. It's not accepting that he's gone, it's trying and wishing that he was still there. That, I think, is the answer, and I wish that Bowlby were still alive and we could discuss it. But I think now, with modern technology, we have been able to discern the difference between these two processes. Next slide, please. So, the main theme of my talk, again, the grief work models needs revision to define when and for whom and what type of working through or disclosure is efficacious, it's helpful. Next slide, please. I'm going to take a very short side because at the time when we developed our model, the stages of grief were not really important to us. They didn't motivate us to develop our own theory as Bowlby and Warden's work did. The stages of grief were based on the Dabda model, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And if you were all in front of me, I would ask you, do you know of Kubler-Ross's work? Have you read her book on death and dying? And what do you think about it? Positive or negative? I think of her work as very positive in general. She has done a tremendous amount for dying people, for bereaved people, in the sense that she's brought death out of the cupboard and enabled us to talk much more about it. What I take exception to is the Dabda model, that she claims that these 5 stages are the ones that bereaved people go through. Next slide, please. Our concerns, and Henk and I and Katrin Berner shared these. We have published an article in Omega quite recently where you can read more about these if you wish. But there is no set pattern going through these 5. It isn't always Dabda. There's no necessary progression through them. There's certainly no sound empirical research, just one study, which was very much criticized, that claimed to show that one went through one stage after another. I think what disturbs me most is the expectation of stages that can be harmful to those not experiencing them. Henk did a lot of therapy when he was young. I'm going to give this example. He was called up by a bereaved father who said he would like to come to him for treatment. And Henk asked him on the phone, why? And he said, because I'm not experiencing anger. And Henk describes this as the shortest therapy ever, because you do not necessarily have to experience anger. And to expect that you have to do this can be harmful. Oh dear, I'm doing it wrong. I'm not going through the DABDA stages as I should be. And alternative perspectives, we think, better represent the grieving processes. And not just our own. Clearly, we developed our model, so we think that that is a better explanation or perspective than the stages approach. But there are other perspectives as well. The meaning making, there's many other perspectives on coping that we feel should be promoted, and that the stages certainly should not be. Next slide, please. This, I think, I love poetic descriptions. I think they say much more than we can. We use chapters and articles and books to describe it. I think that the poets say things in very few words and get the idea across. So let me just read this to you from Linda Pastan's 5 Stages of Grief. The night I lost you, someone pointed me towards the 5 stages of grief. Go that way, they said. It's easy, like learning to climb stairs after the amputation. Acceptance. I finally reach it, but something is wrong. Grief is a circular staircase. I have lost you. Next slide, please. So we now get to the model. And here is Henk. We met in 1992 when I came to the Netherlands for the first time to work. And we had a meeting very early on and realized that our interests were very much overlapping. And we, in those days, had more time, it seemed. We spent a whole day just discussing bereavement and grief and coping and sharing ideas. Henk had just recently done his PhD on grief and bereavement, and I had just, with my husband at that time, had conducted the Tübingen study of bereavement, which was a longitudinal study with widows and widowers and married men and women as controls. So we had a lot to share, really, our different empirical studies. And that got us thinking about coping. And this is what came out. Next slide, please. This. Fortunately, we didn't rub it out before photographing it. But you can actually see this was the work of a long day. We got very excited, as you can probably tell. And it's got the fundamental points of our dual process model. You've got loss and restoration. You've got chronic grief. You've got trauma down at the bottom and delayed. And you've got coping, and you can even see a bit of a mess, a zigzag perhaps, in the middle. So that was the first version. And finally, it became the following. Next slide, please. Here we are, dual process model of coping with bereavement, looking a little bit more presentable. So let me just go over this briefly. This is our way that we feel people cope. In the context of everyday life experience, I think that's important to note. This is taking into account the fact that you need time off, that it's exhausting. People do other things, they have to do other things. But within everyday life experience and social context and everything that we do in our normal daily lives, we experience coping with grief, both loss-oriented and restoration-oriented. These are the 2 types of stressor that we have to deal with. Under loss-oriented coping, we have grief work, intrusion of grief, and we have letting go or continuing relocating bonds and ties. And while we're doing this, there's the avoidance or denial of restoration changes, for the simple reason that while you're thinking about one thing, you can't think about another. But this can change very rapidly, or you can be dwelling on your loss for a long time. It can change over time, of course. But at other times, we reckon that you are restoration oriented. Now, it's important to note that this word does not mean having been restored. This is an active coping focus. We're dealing with stressors here. We're just dealing with different types of stresses. We're attending to life changes, learning to dress the children for school if your wife had done that and she died, doing new things that you've never done before, perhaps learning to give talks online. Distraction from grief. It takes time off from thinking about the person, him or herself. It's perhaps involving denial or avoidance of grief. And finally, very important, you have to develop new roles, identities, and relationships. These don't happen overnight. They don't happen very early on in grief, probably. But over time, you have to consider new ways of going about meeting new people, perhaps, or taking on a new job, maybe moving house and having to develop new relationships with new neighbors and so on. So these things are also stressful. They also have to be dealt with. The finances, for example, may be very stressful indeed if you've lost the income of a partner and have to take on the job in order to make ends meet, pay debts, perhaps. So these two types of stressor necessitate what is perhaps the most original aspect of the model, and that is what we call oscillation, which is an emotion regulation process. So you oscillate between doing the one to doing the other, doing everyday life experience. That basically is what the model is all about. It looks simple, but the implications, I think, are quite complex. And in the meantime, we're actually writing a book about it and putting together the work that we have done, the publications we've done since we first developed this model, and the work of others, many others who've joined us in the effort to really refine, think about, and develop the model and look into its implications and applications. Next slide, please. Comparison of the model very briefly. I think that if you look at the tasks, what we have added is here the restoration element, not only oscillation, which is quite unique, but I think we've added these 4 restoration tasks, if you will: accept the reality of the changed world, take time off from the pain of grief, master the changed subjective environment, and develop new roles, identities, and relationships. So those things have come on top. Warden thinks that our models are not very different, that he covers these 2. I think that we are more explicit, and he actually, I've used his terminology from his 1991 book. In the meantime, he has undergone a number of revisions, new editions of his book, and has changed the wording slightly, which is more perhaps in line with the DPM. But I think that the models complement each other and don't contradict each other. Next slide, please. Here we are again. We may go back to Katie Kollwitz. This is another copy of her sculpture of her husband and herself. This one is in Belgium, and they're side by side, as you can see, facing out into a graveyard. And again, I think this will bring to mind the gender differences. Next slide, please. We have looked into gender differences, and in traditional partners, we did find that women, in fact, are more loss-oriented and men are more restoration oriented in their ways of coping. And that is something that may not apply to different cultures. It may not apply to the more recent generations, but this is the data that we found. And so women seem to be more focused on coping with the loss, and men with doing other tasks and getting on to deal with the practical issues that come about. We did look at the influence of one partner on another in one of our investigations, where we had both fathers and mothers respond to our questionnaires in a study of the loss of a child. And we found interesting interaction effects of one person's grief on another. And in this case, we found that if a woman was more restoration oriented, it helped both herself and her husband over time. That was just one of the findings that we found there. Next slide, please. We also could apply complicated grief types into the DPM. This you saw in our very first slide, that we had put these labels in. These are quite well-known types of complications of grief: chronic versus PTSD, or I've called it traumatic grief here, versus absent or inhibited grief. So it seemed that these labels or these types of complications actually were easily integrated into the model. And you've noted that I put rumination down here, because rumination is associated with complicated grief. People who are high ruminators also suffer more from complications in their grieving. I put chronic grief down at the bottom. There are various other labels. We don't need to go into those, but mostly these days, the diagnostic categories of complicated grief are really reflecting what used to be called chronic grief. Next slide, please. Recently, we developed a new line of thinking in the DPM. It came about from personal experience, actually, that when I lost someone more recently whom I dearly loved, that I just could not deal with a lot of things that normally I deal with, reviewing articles, doing this, doing that, running around. Suddenly, even the normal tasks of daily living seemed a little bit too much, and there was too much going on. And it suddenly occurred to me, it's not coping with loss-oriented stresses versus coping with restoration-oriented stresses. It's having too many stresses overall. So we looked carefully into this notion and finally came up with the definition: the bereaved person's perception of having more than he or she feels she or he can deal with, too much or too many activities, events, experiences, and or other stimuli. So this is a burden, this is a load, this is something heavy that you have to deal with. I think it also introduces into the model something that was missing, and that is mental and physical health consequences. I showed you just now complications in grieving, but we know that there are mental and physical health consequences. I showed you that early in the talk, but they haven't been really integrated into the model. But I think the overload notion links probably with mental and physical health difficulties. If you're overstressed, there's far too much to do, your health is going to suffer. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick visual potential overload showing maybe multiple losses are just too much to deal with. It's the shaking of the very foundations on which the balance is based between loss and restoration. It can be too much of both, but imagine in the corona times, perhaps you lose many family members. It's just too much to take. Next slide, please. I'm moving on towards the cross-cultural now to show you some other work that was done in Hong Kong on psychotherapeutic intervention in cross-cultural perspective. Amy Chow did a study of widowed Chinese people with high grief levels And she used the DPM to guide how she designed her intervention. She has a protocol that she developed and describes in her article here, which I think is very helpful, probably for those of you in counseling. It defines how she goes about integrating the DPM. And she had two conditions. She either assigned people to the dual process, where she covered not only loss-oriented tasks, confronting the loss, talking about the person, seeing pictures, but also restoration-oriented tasks, learning how to cook, doing other things. Or she had simple loss-oriented therapy intervention, which was just the typical type of intervention that you cognitive behavioral therapy would focus on confrontation of the loss. So those two conditions were presented, and the sessions were 2 hours for 7 weeks and an outing in the 8th week. And she had pre, post, and a 16-week follow-up to measure how the therapy worked, how grief was after, how grief declined or didn't decline, as the case may be, 16 weeks later. So she was able to assess which of the programs was more effective. Next slide, please. Now, a lot of writing on here, I'll walk you through it quickly. This was culturally appropriate intervention. First of all, it was group intervention. That was considered more appropriate than individual because, in fact, it is more of a collectivist than individualistic culture. So this worked well. And of course, it meant it was an effective sort of treatment. If you can treat people in groups, then, of course, you gain quite a bit of time and resources by doing so. The intervention was based on a United States intervention program developed by Dale Lund and Caserta. But some of the tasks were not appropriate in this culture. Like, they don't talk about financial or legal or societal participation matters. They were left out of the protocol. The same as the US was attending to life changes and household matters in the restoration, and they added restoration tasks. They had themes of health-related topics, nutrition and self-care, very important. And they added loss-oriented tasks. They had lovely rituals used to express emotions in a structured way. For example, they released fishes into the wild, symbolizing the letting go of pain and suffering. And it was a very pragmatic approach. The last session was actually cooking to put knowledge of nutrition and self-care into practice. Next slide, please. The results. Now, to our delight, both of the interventions worked. There were improvements in grief, depression, and social support. A limitation to the study was that they could not compare with people who had no intervention. That just simply, it's not something that we normally would do. We would always want a control group to see how people develop over time without intervention. This was not possible in this culture. So that is a limitation of the study. We don't know how people would have developed a lot over time, how their grief would have improved over time had they not received the intervention. But they did show differences between the two conditions, and they showed that the dual process, the LORO, loss and restoration treatment, had a greater effect on those outcomes than did the loss treatment alone. And that seemed to us, to be a nice support for our dual process model, that you are oscillating between the loss and the restoration. And those in these dual DPM groups also had reduced anxiety and loneliness, social and emotional. They were lower than the ones who were just in the loss-oriented group. So it seems that treating people and taking into account the other types of stressor is important, particularly in this culture. And I think the interesting thing is how they adapted it to fit the cultural requirements. Next slide, please. So my take-home messages, points to keep in mind. It's very important, I think, to know that there are a variety of normal responses. We mentioned the gender differences, that women tend to be more loss-oriented than men. But insofar as there are no problems, you can be more or less the one or the other. You can be more loss-oriented than restoration-oriented, so long as it doesn't present problems for you, that you are accepting the loss and moving on and taking time to deal with other things, perhaps to a lesser extent, or leaving them till later on. So remember, the normal response is mostly, despite differences in attention to the one or to the other type of stressor. Maladaptation only occurs in extreme, and as I've emphasized, only in a minority. So only if you are exceedingly loss-oriented all the time, ruminating, not able to get over your grief, thinking about the lost person all the time, or totally denying and rushing into life, doing the tasks that are new, that could perhaps later on lead to difficulties. Sometimes it happens that on a second bereavement, maybe even a more minor one, it all comes out. Somebody who has been restoration oriented will later on perhaps get into difficulties, and it could be triggered by a different loss experience. There is need to further test the dual process model. A lot of studies in the meantime are beginning to cover this. I've been reviewing them for our book, and there are quite a number now that are really trying to put it to the test. There was also a recent systematic review by Jennifer Fiore, who mentioned the limitations, particularly the difficulty of testing oscillation, but concluded that the DPM accurately represents the bereavement experience and can be used to understand how bereaved individuals cope. Well, that warmed our hearts, but it's up to each and every one of you to draw your own conclusions as to whether it does represent your experience or those of the people that you are counseling or coming into contact with in bereavement situations. But this is our way of going about understanding grief and grieving. Next slide, please. Thank you for listening and for watching from afar.
Professor Stroebe, thank you so much for that very comprehensive and illuminating presentation. It was, I feel privileged to be here listening. And thanks again on behalf of Grief School.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much.